From the CISO Series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
General Dynamics says employees targeted in phishing attack. Japan Airlines systems are back to normal after a cyber attack. And TechCrunch lists the most badly handled data breaches of 2024. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have selected from this past week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we're ready for some insight, opinion, and expertise, from our five-time returning guest, the Martin Short of the Week in Review, Steve Zalewski, cybersecurity advisor and CISO in residence. Steve, I got to ask, it was a holiday week. How was your week in cybersecurity?
Fortunately, I would say pretty quiet and pretty productive.
That's what we were hoping for. We on our last Week in Review, we were hoping, like let's not jinx it. Let's keep stuff quiet. We got a little bit of activity over the weekend, so we'll get into it in the week's news. But Steve, I'm so thrilled to have you on to send out 2024. Of course, our sponsor that's joining us on this journey to end the year is, of course, ThreatLocker, Zero Trust Endpoint Protection Platform. You can join us on YouTube Live. To do so, go to CISOSeries.com, hit the events drop down, and look for the cybersecurity headlines Week in Review image. You can join CCL and all of our other regulars in the chat. We've got the big boss man, David Spark, in there as well. You help make the show better. Please get your comments in. I love to see your perspective. What stands out to you in the stories? What your reaction to them is, what you're worried about in the news. Like, that always helps inform how we can bring the best stories to you. And just a quick reminder before we jump into the stories that the opinions that Steve is going to express are in fact his own and not necessarily those of anyone else. This is you're getting the pure, undiluted Steve Zalewski opinions. We've got about 20 minutes though, so let's jump into it. First story here: General Dynamics says employees are targeted in a phishing attack. The aerospace and defense company says threat actors compromised dozens of employee benefits accounts after a successful phishing campaign targeted its personnel. The activity was discovered on October 10th and took the form of a fraudulent advertising campaign that directed General Dynamics employees to a phishing site where they were deceived into entering their usernames and passwords. A total of 37 people were impacted, and in addition to accessing PII and government ID numbers, which not great. In some cases, attackers changed bank account information that can have all sorts of nastiness attached to it. So, Steve, we've talked many times on this show about the propensity for sophisticated threat actors to penetrate infrastructure of organizations, not necessarily for stealing email addresses or direct monetary theft, but to take root inside the system. Here we have a major defense contractor. That's basically what's going on here. I'm curious, as a CISO, how does that make you feel?
I'm frustrated. It's just incredibly frustrating, right? When I see things like this, where humans and human weakness to want to help each other and do the right thing just continues to be preyed on over and over again. And in this case, it's a defense contractor that knows that they're targeted, okay? Obviously has good security, puts a lot of time and effort into training, so they do everything right. And yet we continuously see humans make mistakes, right? And so that's why I characterize it. It's so frustrating that we do everything we know how to do. But until I can get humans, right, to just change their underlying behavior, we are going to constantly be in this kind of fight.
And I imagine, any large organization, defense contractor, I would hope, has, they have a playbook, right, to deal with this. Like there's the anticipation that they are going to be targeted with this kind of stuff all the time, and at some point, like that's just part of any resiliency strategy, right? At this point, right?
Yeah, you'll hear compensating controls and defense in depth, which is attempting to implement this resiliency, this realization that as much as I want to prevent the attack, that some do come through. In this case, social engineering is it. And so I protect some things more than others. Intellectual property, maybe, military secrets, So there's a lot more friction, right? That's put into the process, role-based access control, multi-factor authentication, where we're making it harder for the employee to do their job, but they understand that that friction is necessary because we can't let the bad guys win, right? But there's a line there as to how much friction I can introduce depending upon the secrecy or the importance of what it is I'm trying to protect for the company.
And as CCL points out, this is the fifth largest defense contractor in the world. I have to imagine I would imagine for an employee there is a greater understanding of that, like that friction trade-off, right? Whereas I don't know, if you're at an insurance firm, it may just be like, oh, I can't, this is getting in the way. But regardless of the organization, I feel like there needs to be more of that conversation of how do we communicate that, like, these controls are not arbitrary. These are, yes, you have to, do MFA, or you have to, you have to add some additional controls on top of that, like, to show the benefit that it's worth making your job a little bit more of a pain in the butt to do, right?
Yeah, well, remember, it comes down to time and money.
That's,
Okay.
yeah, okay.
I can put a front door in, I can put a front gate in, I can put a back gate in, right? And I can make it very difficult for you to go outside and play in traffic. But at the end of the day, right, I can only put so much time and effort in, and then I have to just educate you and have you do the right thing. And I think that's the yin and the yang that you hear on the security side about, well, I'm just going to make you do the right thing. But the line of business ultimately is deciding how much pain and aggravation they're willing to accept from cybersecurity, and then they just ignore it. And that's why we can't control our destiny. Our lines of business and the bad guys do generally.
All right, well, next up here, speaking of disruption to business, Japan airline systems are back to normal after a cyber attack. The airline announced yesterday, Thursday, December 26th, that its systems have returned to normal following a cyber attack that delayed some flights. The attack occurred at 7:24 a.m. local time and shut down a router that was causing malfunctions, and which suspended ticket sales for flights departing on Thursday. Representatives said no customer data was leaked and no damage was registered, question mark. This event follows on the heels of a brief outage that also impacted flights for American Airlines on Tuesday, Christmas Eve. That particular outage was issued at the airline's request after it experienced trouble with a flight operating system, or FOS. The airline blamed technology from one of its vendors. There's no indication that this was a cyber attack, but we had two transportation holiday disruption stories, so it kind of made sense here. But Steve, so many flights occurring worldwide, especially during the busy holiday season. These small incidents can easily get buried in the news cycle when it's not, when you can't have cameras pointing to thousands of people sitting in the airport and kind of stranded, and that kind of stuff doesn't make that great of a story. But wouldn't it be disturbing if maybe 6 months down the road an investigation shows this was a little bit more than a simple router malfunction? In the case of American Airlines, we also have, another standard explanation, the old third-party vendor. I'm curious, these two stories, what's your take on this?
So this when I read this, and there was a DDoS attack associated with this,
Mm-hmm.
is the appreciation of the difference between health and safety versus availability, right?
Mm.
Security, confidentiality, availability, and integrity. Health and safety, you don't want people to get hurt. Things like airlines are driven by health and safety. So a simple DDoS attack that you can't get to, let's assume the FOS system, so they can't assign the pilots and the airline support personnel, they can't fly, right? Because they're obligated to have full crews.
Mm-hmm.
So what I see more and more often here is that these major systemic impacts to services that people take for granted, okay, like healthcare or like airlines, where they haven't had to breach the systems. They've just had to impact the availability of certain systems, which then causes the system to have to go into hold mode. Okay. We're going to see more and more of that because what people are trying to do in some cases is just, impact the social fabric of how we live. And these types of DDoS attacks, to your point, may go under the radar screen, but not really, because a 30-minute outage for a DDoS attack, that's all it took, right? They had to do a ground
Mhm.
hold for 30 minutes. Everything that flies is now in hold for 30 minutes. It backs up the entire system because those planes can't leave. All the major airports have got slotting. So you can have these huge disruptions because we can't mess with health and safety.
Yeah, these limits, and we've talked to healthcare CEOs, and I always have the most empathy for that situation, because you're right, that health and safety is the business, right? Like, that's the mission right there. That's the cannot compromise this, and it's seemingly opens up so many different ways to disrupt that, like you said, with just a simple DDoS, and it has all this knock-on effect. So yeah, definitely something. This was been kind of a trend that we've been seeing. I think of municipalities, healthcare, and kind of the airlines as seeing, for different reasons, having different kind of being particularly vulnerable to this kind of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how the industry, if we've come to any kind of best practices for responding to this next year, or if this trend just continues, for sure.
Well, the trend is going to continue. And here's what kills me: a 30-minute outage can take 6 hours to remediate, right? Because once the damage is done, it doesn't take me 30 minutes to just get everything back. Okay. Those planes have to take off. I can't compress time.
Mhm.
And so here are ways, right? If you want to be able to do major impact, it takes a minor exercise to have a pretty major impact on society.
All right, next up here, TechCrunch lists the most badly handled data breaches of 2024. TechCrunch is out with its annual summary of breaches whose behavior or response to could at least be seen as maybe a learning opportunity for others, if we're being generous. This year's list includes 23andMe, who blamed their customers for not sufficiently securing their accounts. They were attacked with a credential stuffing attack. Change Healthcare, who took months to confirm hackers stole most of America's health data by breaching a basic user account with a lack of multi-factor authentication. Also on the list, Snowflake, whose breach was a result of a lack of mandated use of multi-factor security, and the city of Columbus, Ohio, sorry Buckeyes, who sued a security researcher for truthfully reporting on a ransomware attack. So, Steve, we're not looking to certainly make light of the efforts of dedicated security personnel who work for these companies or organizations, but all 8 of the stories listed by TechCrunch seem to show some degree of corporate clumsiness, or maybe a misunderstanding, some interesting priorities, let's say. I'm curious, do you have one or two from that list that stand out to you, or maybe something that didn't make the list?
Um, so I went through the list and I actually looked at each of the type of incident and just tried to summarize. And the thing that struck me was, depending upon how you count, half of those incidences were identity and access management, where the humans were phished, right? And their credentials were compromised. That's it. So it's funny how the conversation we were just having, right, at the defense contractor, and the fact that people are being socially engineered all the time because we want to help and we're the weakest link, that is the majority of the incidences for last year. And the consequence always is, well, do multi-factor authentication, right? And yet, why, for something that's so obvious, can't we do it? Because the friction, right? And then it comes back to, well, you're blaming the customer, and the customer can never be wrong. So I just wanted, from my perspective, when I look, to give people an opportunity to go, when you look at that and you look at the root cause and you look at how either they're placing blame or trying to train people on the value of implementing multi-factor authentication, and they're counting on us as the consumers to do it, and we choose not to, right? Then they get breached. Well, we can't tell the customer he was wrong, yet I, as the business, right, can only have a certain amount of influence in your behavior.
Well, 23andMe tried, right? They tried to throw everybody, and we saw how well that will. And that one, I'm of two minds. One, just don't do that ever. It's like it's never the right call, right? But also, like, I also feel like in some ways that was like to tell shareholders that, but that gets kind of more into into a little bit of corporate speak. But yeah, like I mean, but you also, like, in that particular case, you also have to know, like, that's the game, right? Like, whenever you allow users to create accounts, they're going to do it badly, Like that just has to be the basic assumption, right?
Or, and that's what I mean, I go, if the intrinsic value of the data, like 23andMe, if it's my DNA data, then do I have an obligation to only allow multi-factor authentication to log in because I am making the determination that the classification of that data is radioactive hot for what would happen if you make a mistake? So I'm taking the steps to preventing you from making the mistake, right? That is some of the conversations we're having to have is, well, is it obvious, intuitively obvious, that that data is so critical if it got out, like healthcare data? Okay, that's a
Mhm.
classic case. You don't let that get out. We're going to make you do MFA. You're going to complain about it, but we're simply saying we can't assume the risk of you being wrong.
All right. Well, before we get into our next story, which kind of links, kind of the is the other side of the coin here. So it's a really interesting story. We have to spend a few moments with our sponsor for today, ThreatLocker. Do zero-day exploits and supply chain attacks keep you up at night? Worry no more. You can harden your security with ThreatLocker. ThreatLocker helps you take a proactive, default deny approach to cybersecurity and provides a full audit of every action, allowed or blocked, for risk management and compliance. Onboarding and operation are fully supported by their US based support team. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help keep your organization running efficiently and protected from ransomware, visit threatlocker.com. All right, Steve, I can't wait to get your take on this. Microsoft 365 users hit by random product deactivation errors. Microsoft is looking into an issue in which customers using Microsoft 365 Office apps are encountering product deactivated errors. Specifically, these occur when moving users between licensing groups, so something like Azure Active Directory groups or synced on premises security groups, or switching user subscription, so going from an Office 365 to Microsoft 365 license and all of the glorious Byzantine confusion that can occur there. Affected users should be able to click the reactivate button on the error banner and sign in when prompted to resolve the issue, or they can sign out of everything, all Microsoft 365 apps, close them all down, restart, and then be able to sign back in. And Microsoft also said it's doing a server-side fix on the back end a few days later. But Steve, this might seem a little innocuous, maybe an obscure story, limited, small number of users and some admins, but there's some things that stand out here. First, it's Microsoft. At their scale, there's kind of nothing small, even if it's a small percentage of users. Please try and take a feature out of Windows and see what a small percentage of Microsoft users will have to say about that. Second, maybe more disturbing is the ease by which they say, yeah, just click that reactivate button. Isn't that literally the type of stuff we're talking about where that seems like a very phishing adjacent behavior, right? A threat actor with a spoof Windows login page kind of has that same lure that we're training people not to do. Is that a problem?
So here's the yin and the yang of that. For as long as computers have been around, like laptops and desktops and Windows, what's the answer been when something goes wrong? Reboot, right? It's a software problem, just reboot. Your point here is we've been doing that for 35 or 40 years. When something goes wrong, what do? Reboot. And yet, from a product testing perspective, that should not be an acceptable answer. We should be able to build systems that are robust and stay up. Yet, so here's a situation where there was a mistake made in coding. It wasn't caught in all of the testing. Okay. And so now it's out in the field. Well, why didn't it get caught in testing? Shame on you. And now that it's out in the field, what do? We basically say reboot, which is the very thing that the bad guys constantly are reinforcing, which is, hey, just reboot. Okay. And so to your point, this is why I say, look at what we're doing now is because we're not taking responsibility to remove this as an alternative. So you say, just reactivate again and we'll catch it next time through. Not as a normal course of operation. And so long as we continue to enable and support that type of behavior, we're basically giving it to the bad guys.
Yeah, it to me, yeah, this just screams as like, I don't know, like learning. I don't even want to call it the learning opportunity. It seems to just go against a lot of what we constantly are talking about in the show in terms of security practice, stuff like that. So thank you for elucidating that so well, Steve. I really appreciate that. Speaking of responsibility, though, CISA taking responsibility, adding Beyond Trust Flaw to its known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. This is a story that we discussed last Friday on Week in Review, but now things have escalated a little, with Beyond Trust having been added to CISA's known exploited vulnerability, or KEV catalog. According to its advisory, a critical vulnerability has been discovered in privileged remote access and remote support products, which can allow an unauthenticated attacker to inject commands that are run as a site user. The CVSS scores for this is 9.8, and federal agencies have until December 27th to fix it. Of course, today is December 27th, so I imagine quite a few security people working for federal agencies have had to cut their holiday season maybe a little short, or work into maybe a little later in the year they're planning for. I'm curious, Steve, what are your thoughts about incidents where companies we trust to supply security make a mistake or even get sabotaged?
Yeah, this is CrowdStrike all over again, right? From a different perspective, but these are the crown jewels, right? This product protects our crown jewels, our service accounts, our privileged things where, the IT people are trying to do the right thing. And you could argue they should have a much higher bar of testing and release
Mhm.
because they are protecting the crown jewels. And so, whereas the last time you asked me earlier, right? And I go, I was, frustrated. Well, this one just gets me aggravated. Okay.
Mm.
Because here I am implementing PAM tools, doing everything right for my teams to be able to try to prevent the bad guys. And then the underlying software, right, has problems, exploitable, right? And now I've got to have a fire drill, right, of bringing in because 9.8, 9.9 criticals have to be patched within 48 hours, exploited in the wild, right? So the IT teams and the security teams, right, are having to pay the burden of us not being able to build truly, right, world class protected software, especially for critical systems.
Yeah, that perspective of, yeah, you're doing the things that people are telling you to do, right? You're trying to be ahead of the curve here, and you're getting bit because of that. I imagine, like, I just imagine that, like, just explaining that has to be incredibly frustrating, right? Like, as a CISO, it's like, oh, we had to pull in we had to pull in this whole staff for overtime, all this stuff. Like, that alone has to be so insanely frustrating.
Right. And it's because it's got a larger systemic impact, right? It's the IT people with the trusted secrets that if they get in, they can do substantial damage, right? About how they're propagating through my systems. So it's a small hole that I've protected highly, but once you're in, right, you're into the Garden of Eden, so to speak. And that is why it's really, really frustrating to go through all that. And can you imagine having a conversation, me as a CISO with my executive team? Well, Steve, we gave you all this money and all these people. You put it all in. So what? Now what?
So, Steve, we've gone from frustrated, we're approaching anger here. Okay, I don't like the way the curve of this show is going, so I'm going to try and bring us all back here. Okay, let's pull some good news out of this last story here for today. Using LLMs to generate malware variants. Okay, doesn't sound great on the outset, but let's dig into the details here. An analysis by Palo Alto Network's Unit 42 looked at the ability of threat actors to rewrite existing malware. The researchers use models to rewrite known malware samples iteratively using techniques like variable renaming, string splitting, junk code insertion, removal of unnecessary white spaces, and a complete reimplementation of the code. The idea is that these changes, small or large, could degrade the overall effectiveness of malware classification systems while also making the code look more naturally written when reviewed by a human. To combat this, Palo Alto generated tens of thousands of variants to train its own detection. Excuse me. Palo Alto generated tens of thousands of variants to train its own detection algorithms, and it reportedly saw a 10% detection rate improvement. So, Steve, a little bit of the old cat and mouse game being played by Palo Alto here, and they're certainly not the only ones that are doing this, but they documented this report, which I found really interesting, identifying techniques to improve malware through generative AI, as well as using those same techniques to train their own products to get better. A story in today's superhuman.ai newsletter, which if you're not subscribed, is definitely worth giving it a gander, shows that jailbreaking LLMs is not all that difficult. With even just random capitalizations within a prompt, you can get an LLM to do things that theoretically it shouldn't be able to do. I'm curious, what are your observations on the success of Gen AI on kind of either side of this battle?
You call it a cat and mouse game, and I agree. The problem is defense, right? The protectors are the mice. I'd like to be the cat for a change. Okay. But what you're seeing here is the weaponization of technology generally plays to the advantage of the cat, right? In this case, the bad guys can weaponize that technology much faster than I can for defense, meaning they can generate tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of variations, right? And they can throw it at me at the speed of machine. I, on the other side, can try to get a little smarter by doing some of that proactively, but for the most part, I'm reactive. I have to respond to the attacks as they come in, and I don't have the computes necessarily, right, to determine if it's really bad and some is going to get through. And that, from a weaponization perspective, is just the current reality and has been for a while, which is I would love to be on the front end of weaponization for defense, but it's just a really difficult problem because generally I'm held to a higher accountability of being right, whereas they just have to be good enough.
Yeah, it would be nice if it was kind of a Tom and Jerry situation, right? We can pull out a tongue and all
Yes.
the grisly stuff. And CCL brings up a really good point in here, saying static detections. This would definitely seems like it would a good approach here. But I wonder if these variants avoid dynamic detections too. Really, yeah. And I mean, I think I think what Palo Alto is doing is again, Steve, to your point, trying to respond to what they know is going to be a flood of these. If they're not already seeing it, they know this is just an inevitability at this point, and trying to just see what works and trying to stay ahead there. I do wonder if we are going to see a little bit more of those, not strike back tools, but more aggressive defensive tools, because we're able to turn around more quickly theoretically if we're able to do this kind of software variation at this kind of scale and with this kind of speed. I wonder if there is an opportunity there for like a more aggressive set of tools in that regard. But we will have to see. I'm very interested to see this, and I know we either have or have just released a Defense in Depth that gets into this topic as well. The pros and cons do. I think it's coming out in January. In fact, if it helps or detracts from AI tools from defense, so it's very interesting and definitely a topic we'll be revisiting a lot. Another person we'll be revisiting a lot is you, Steve Zalewski, just crushing it. Fifth time here. Can't wait to have you on a sixth. Before we get you out of here, was there any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller today? Hey, we got a trophy for you, by the way. I didn't mention it before. We have a trophy for your 5 time. If you're watching the video, thank you, Steve.
Wow.
Yeah, it's the
Wow.
best. I mean, that would be my thumbs up personally if I got a trophy. But was there any story that stood out to you today that you just had a strong reaction to?
I was to me, it's the LLMs to generate variants. It's the appreciation that we are seeing technology, right, abused quicker than we can use it for good. And just a lot of this energy and enthusiasm is, again, I would say I'm frustrated for a set of reasons, right, today with these kinds of things. Not that I'm giving up the good fight, but we're acknowledging the limitations of our ability for defense. And we've got to continue to think outside the box to figure out how we can someday be the cat.
Well, thank you so much again, Steve Zalewski, cybersecurity advisor and CISO in residence and co-host of Defense in Depth. If you're not subscribed to that podcast, what are you doing? Get over there, subscribe, get over there, CISOseries.com, subscribe to it. Steve is amazing on there with all of our great guests, and of course, the big boss man, David Spark. David Cross in the chat wants to know, where's the fifth timer jacket like on SNL? That's in the mail. I sent it DHL snail. So
Okay.
we don't know when that's going to get there, but hopefully everything will be okay. I have insurance on it, so don't worry, Steve. It's going to be okay. And Steve, where can people find you on the cyberspace if they are so inclined to keep following you for some great thoughts?
Sure. Well, I think what you said, CISO Series Defense in Depth, that's kind of my home base
Mhm.
where we talk not about what's hard about security, but what we can do about it. And then people are willing to look at me on LinkedIn. And then a shout out to being CISO in residence for the Professional Association of CISOs, which is a new organization that's patterned after the American Bar Association, where we're taking the practice of cybersecurity and we're now on the path of making it the profession of cybersecurity with attestation and accreditation processes.
Excellent. That sounds exciting. That sounds really awesome, Steve. So thank you for sharing that, for all of your wisdom, and just for your time today on a busy holiday week, for joining us to close out the year. Truly appreciate it.
Pleasure was all mine. Rich, thank you.
Thanks also to our sponsor for today, ThreatLocker, Zero Trust Endpoint Protection Platform. Thanks to everybody that was in our audience today. I see David Cross, CCL. I'm doing Romper Room again, but I'm gonna name you. If you show up, I'm going to name you. And of course, the big boss man, David Spark himself, in there, helping us make the show better, giving us their thoughts, perhaps even a little snark. That's fine with me too. We can take it. We have thick skin as well. But if you haven't joined us already, you should definitely. We are here every single Friday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And you can check us out. We'll go through the week of the news of the week with one of our great CISO guests. Just a quick programming note: there will be no Super Cyber Friday next week, but we will have a weekend review show, so that will be a lot of fun. If you always want to check out our events, look at our events page at CISOseries.com. And in the meantime, you can still get your daily news fix every single day through cybersecurity headlines. Give us about 6 minutes. We'll get you all caught up. Until the next time we meet, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.